Coalition. And if you want to join, I'll put my email in the chat and you're welcome to join us. We planned a day of action, an international day of action, and there were people flyering farmers markets in Palo Alto and stopping people on the street and talking to them in Philadelphia. There was a protest outside Barbara Lee's office, outside Jim McGovern's office. So we're trying to get the word out that escalation, sending more weapons, is not going to resolve what cannot be resolved militarily. We don't have one Democrat yet in Congress willing to say that. We do, however, have Congresswoman Jayapal, the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, about to release a letter calling for pairing military aid to Ukraine with a focus on supporting negotiations. So that letter is under discussion by various groups, and we'll be talking about it tomorrow when our Peace in Ukraine Coalition holds its call. And again, if you want to participate, just email me, marcy@codepink.org, but I'll put that in the chat. What else? NATO held a summit. I know Massachusetts Peace Action will have a terrific show on that, on the resistance to that, the challenge to that, the No to NATO movement in Europe and here. Code Pink had a few representatives, Colonel Ann Wright, Packy Wieland, who traveled to Madrid to march with those protesters demanding the dissolution of NATO as a threat to world peace. Inside the halls of NATO, the member countries, 30 now, they extended a formal invitation to Finland and Sweden. Finland's on the border with Russia to join NATO. So that's in the works. They also decided to increase their high alert readiness troops from under 50,000 to 300,000 to be ready to go to war anytime by land, air, or sea. It's no longer really the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Also at the table at the NATO summit were countries in the Pacific, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, the Republic of Korea. So all of that is happening. Ukraine, I again ask you to join us. We have a website, peaceinukraine.org. Check it out. Okay, thanks, Cole.
Thanks, Marcy, for that great overview. Now it's my privilege to introduce our featured speaker, Richard Rubenstein. He is University Professor of Conflict Resolution and Public Affairs at George Mason University. He holds degrees from Harvard, Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, Harvard Law, and the University of Malta. A former lawyer, political scientist, and director of the Carter School, he is the author of 9 books about various types of violent social conflict and the possibilities of resolving them nonviolently. His most recent book is Resolving Structural Conflicts, Violent Systems and How They Can Be Transformed. He teaches graduate and undergraduate courses on conflict theory, and he speaks publicly on issues of peace and social justice. We invited him here tonight because on June 6th and 7th, the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network convened a study group of experts in international affairs, military and security affairs, and international relations among the US, the European Union, Ukraine, and Russia, hosted at Vatican City. The group developed a statement examining the possibility of a negotiated settlement of the Russia-Ukraine war. And Richard Rubenstein, we call on you to explain this work to us and what are the possibilities of that settlement.
All right, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor. And thank you for inviting me. And I have to say that, I guess to begin with, that I am, you expect a speaker in a situation like this to give you some sort of authoritative word on what's what. But I have to say that I don't feel like I'm in a position to do that at all. I'm hoping, in fact, to get some inspiration and ideas from the people in this meeting, because I think one of the things we have to do and to come back to talking about is the profound weakness of the peace movement in our country and the profound weakness of the peace in Ukraine movement internationally. To try to get a handle on that and maybe talk about what can be done to strengthen it. I was very excited to be invited to go to the Vatican. And to attend this meeting, which Cole just mentioned to you, with other people who were, I think, experts. We always comes with a quotation marks, experts. And in this case, some of the people who came to this meeting were really extraordinarily interesting. And I can talk about that a little later if you want me to. But some people who made a great deal of sense, who knew a lot about Russia, a lot about Ukraine, and made a great deal of sense about what was going on there. The meeting was held really almost by accident because Jeffrey Sachs, the economist from Columbia, has become a passionate critic of U.S. foreign policy in general and in Ukraine in particular, and has, by the way, an article out today that came out today, which is very interesting, about the United States-Ukraine policy being basically a product of neoconservatism, the neocon philosophy being taken over by the Biden administration, or taking over the Biden administration. I posted on Facebook about it today. I shared it today on Facebook. Sachs is doing some wonderful work. And when I say this happened by accident, it really happened because Jeff Sachs, through his development work in connection with the UN, has become a kind of informal advisor to the Vatican, to the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences, which is an interesting institution, actually. And the word was, and this is informal, I have no direct evidence of it, but the word was that the Pope wanted this meeting. We know that Pope Francis has got an interest in peace in generally, and in the Ukraine and Russia also, that he wants to go to Ukraine and Russia. He's said that, and he's issued a couple of very interesting statements about the conflict already himself. So we were really there to, I guess, to provide ammunition for him when he does whatever he's going to do. His health is not so great lately, so I'm not sure what he's going to be able to do. But what fascinated me about it was the notion of an international organization, in this case, the church, which would not be bound to follow the line promoted by any particular state, including the United States, which therefore has some independence of mind and possible independence of action, which Francis has occasionally demonstrated he knows how to use. And one looks these days for institutions which are capable of carrying the kind of message that you and I are interested in promoting to the world, because they're not entirely dominated by and under the thumb of some government. I very much enjoyed being at this meeting and listening to people like Anatol Lievin from the Quincy Institute, who has a great deal to say about Russia and Ukraine if you've followed his writing. A number of the Europeans there who had a great deal of experience in dealing with conflicts in Europe. Also, Nina Khrushcheva was there, and to listen to her talk about Russia, Khrushchev's granddaughter, was wonderful. It was really very interesting to hear her talk, and we became some semi-friends. And when it came my time to speak, I took advantage of it. I wasn't representing my school. Nobody was representing anybody. But I am a professor at the Carter School at George Mason University, Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. And also, by the way, want you to know about that place and consider it a place which you might be able to use or have contact with at some time or other. And so when it came my time to talk, I had spent a lot of time writing and thinking about religion and conflict, I spoke about the fact that some of the best criticisms of what the U.S. is doing in Ukraine and in Russia, this grotesque reversion to Cold War policy, which is going on, was criticized effectively by realists like John Mearsheimer and Waltz and the rest of that crowd, and Anatol from the Quincy Institute, Anatol Lievin as well, who I guess you would consider a realist, although especially talented one. People who were pointing out that so far from the Ukraine conflict being unprovoked, to use one of the administration's favorite words to describe it, it was plenty well provoked by activities of NATO over the past 8 years. And that the whole notion that the Russians would simply sit by while Ukraine became part of the NATO military machine and billions of dollars of weapons were poured into NATO. There was one of the points made at the meeting was that the weapons shipments from NATO and the West into Ukraine did not begin with the Russian invasion, that Ukraine had been was being turned into a military base well in advance of that. And those criticisms were very well taken. But I felt in some ways that my role there was also to point out some of the limitations of the realist critique of US policy in the Ukraine. In fact, to try to deal with the tremendous power of the moral/ideological argument that's made, that so many Americans and Europeans also have found so convincing, in helping them to decide that Russia is solely responsible for the conflict and needs to be punished severely for invading Ukraine. So what I found myself talking about were really items which I had spoken about, I'd written about in a book I wrote a number of years ago called Reasons to Kill. The subtitle is Why Americans Choose War. Bloomsbury brought it out and pretty much nobody read it. So, but I think what it had to say actually was meaningful. It said, the book said that people in America and also in other countries don't go to war or support a war simply for reasons of narrow national interest. If you tell them that we can gain some territory or make some money by going to war, they generally won't buy into it. There has to be a moral justification for the war. It has to be portrayed in effect as a just war. And so when Putin invaded Ukraine, that was made to order, especially for people who were coming to the decision that they wanted a confrontational, in fact, a bellicose relationship with Russia and above all with China, that this was made to order for them because they could portray this as an unjust war. As you probably know, there were Russian apologists and Putin apologists who took the position that the war was perfectly justified, that the invasion was justified, and and they took the Russian side. But the more complicated issue, the issue that I wanted to talk, and I did talk about at this wonderful meeting room in the Vatican, was that in such cases, what you have is a problem of shared responsibility for a war. Shared responsibility. Putin had no business invading, in my view, Ukraine. But it was not at all unprovoked. It was also provoked. And a large share of responsibility, what percentage, I don't want to say, it's not necessary to say, is borne by the United States and borne by the West in their absolute indifference to and refusal to deal with legitimate security questions and identity questions, which were being raised by the Russians in connection with that conflict and had been raised by Putin for some time. So if you don't have a concept of shared responsibility, which leads towards a vision of peace based on shared responsibility for peace, then what you end up with is the kind of grotesque, what I called in my book, partisan moralism, which results in each side holding the other to be solely morally responsible for the war, and which in the United States has a very familiar pattern that's been reenacted. I don't think I have to go into great detail with you folks about this, but the idea that this is a war of choice by the enemy, which means it's a war forced upon us by the enemy. They choose, and we have no choice but to defend. They are malicious. One of the reasons they choose is because they like to fight. But we don't like to fight. We're essentially peace-loving. So the enemy's maliciousness then extends to its cruelty. The enemy has no real respect for human life. Unlike us, we try to limit collateral damage. They don't care about collateral damage. And of course, as I go through these items, and I'll do it quickly, I'm sure you'll recognize that just by reading the New York Times every morning, which I'm still forcing myself to do, that all of these images are present on virtually every page of coverage of the conflict by journals like the New York Times and the Washington Post. That the enemy is cruel and we are not. That the enemy is deceitful and we are not. We mean what we say, but you can't trust them to do anything that they promise to do. They're totally untrustworthy. And the reason that they are so malicious and so cruel and so deceitful is that they want to be God, is that they want to rule the world. They're megalomaniacs. Our interests are only in defending our own sphere of influence, even if that. Our interests are only in defending our own principles. Their interests are in attaining universal power. Well, as soon as you start to put, I wanted to say this in the Vatican, especially because as soon as you put these images together of the enemy that is malicious, inherently violent, inherently untrustworthy, and that wants to be God, you have the father of lies, right? You have the one who wants to overthrow God. You have Satan. And this is not just demonization of the enemy. Demonization has become a word that means nothing. This is actually the Satanization of the enemy. It has very deep roots in Christian culture and in American culture. And it's powerful medicine. It's powerful propaganda for people who are anti-war to have to deal with, to be able to deal with. And one of the problems that we have in trying to oppose this sort of war drive, it seems to me, is that we want to talk about moral ambiguity. We want to talk about complexity. We need to talk about the fact that the people who invaded Russia, the people who invaded Ukraine probably shouldn't have invaded Ukraine, but that doesn't relieve the West of its character of being an imperialist force. So that when we try to characterize, which I did in my talk at the Vatican, I tried to characterize finally this conflict as fundamentally a conflict between empires. Nina Khrushcheva had some wonderful things to say about the strange sort of empire that Russia is. But however one wants to deal with that question, it's quite clear that the United States is a global empire. I don't have to convince you of that. And that that it saw this opportunity to deal with Russia in a way which would not only affirm its own imperial interests, but would further subject Europe to the status of junior partner in the imperial, in a Western imperialist structure, whose main purpose may well be not to just to take on Russia or to try to what they're now talking about defeating Russia, which of course is madness, but to get ready for the war with China, to get ready to confront China. So I spoke about this and ended really. I mean, the after everybody had their piece to say, and some of the statements were really wonderful. I wish they had been published. They're not published. Richard Falk, in particular, was just terrific. Gave a terrific statement from he came in from Istanbul. When it was all over, we worked out a statement. And the statement, but you have a copy of the statement, so I don't have to summarize it for you here. I'll summarize it very briefly for you here. It's the statement which Steve Sachs originally drafted, which Jeff Sachs originally drafted, said that, look, either this conflict in Ukraine is going to become a frozen conflict. Nobody's going to win it. It's either going to become a frozen conflict, which just goes on and on and on, and in which all the sanctions against Russia are continued and Russia becomes the enemy, and we go back to the Cold War even more than we've already gone back to it, and we get ready to deal with China and all the rest. Or else there'll be a negotiation. There has to be. It's going to end Sachs said in some sort of negotiation. So let's talk about what that negotiation might look like now. Then the conference entered an interesting phase in which people talked about what the terms of the negotiation, the way the negotiation might take place, and the terms of it might be. And I found myself having to kind of play the role, in this case, of an expert. In this case, I did have a little expertise to try to head off the impulse of some of the people there to kind of come up with a peace plan, kind of to do a Richard Pearl performance and do a peace plan and say, well, this is what should happen to Crimea, and this is the way. But the general principles, at any rate, were altogether agreed upon. The principles were, number one, that Ukraine would be neutral as between NATO and Russia and the Russian allies. Ukraine would be neutralized. That was an easy one because Zelensky had already said before the Americans shut him up, which happened a few months ago. Zelensky said, he hadn't repeated it since then, but he said that that Ukraine should not join NATO, that it should be neutral, as between the two blocs. It should basically be a buffer state. Several people in the conference, though, decided that this should not deny the Ukraine the right to join the European Union if they wanted to. And so they, over a small objection on my part and a few other people who were there, they put that in the statement too, that Ukraine should have the joint. We can talk about that if you like. Ukraine should have the right to join the EU. That was the number one issue. The number two issue was the Donbass. And there was general agreement that some form of autonomy for Donbass the Russian-speaking part of the Ukraine, the industrial part of Ukraine, would have to be worked out, and that the Ukrainians would have to live with losing total sovereignty over the Donbass if sovereignty meant that they could continue ruling it as Kiev had been trying to rule it since 2014. That is, banning Russian and the Russian language and all of that, that they were going to have to stop doing that. It was understood, interestingly understood, that we don't really know what the people of the Donbass exactly want, except we think it's pretty clear they don't want to be ruled by Kiev in the way they were being ruled but before. Whether they want to be part of Russia is a whole other question we don't know. But some form of and I convinced them just to say autonomy and stop there, with the details to be worked out later as to what the autonomy meant. Then there was the question of Crimea, and there were some proposals, that very specific proposals, about how Crimea should be, Russian interest in Crimea should be recognized. And it's quite clear that Crimea is going to stay part of Russia. But again, the statement backs off any particular conclusion to that and says the people of Crimea are eventually going to have to have a referendum or something, or decide, have what they want to do. The one subject that was not dealt with, in my view, adequately at all had to do with demilitarization of Eastern Europe. And it was interesting that I ran up against, I wanted this to be part of the, of the principles that would be understood. And Jeff Sachs totally agreed that what Putin had demanded, a rethinking of the security architecture of Europe. That was one of the demands that the West decided was in the view of the Americans, a non-starter. But I would like to have seen them go a little further with that, because the Russians are not just simply going to sit there and watch missile bases with offensive capabilities be built in Romania and Poland and everywhere else. And so that this is going to, at some point, clearly going to have to be dealt with as well. And there, at any rate, that's where it stopped. The discussion stopped. The discussion did not, for example, get to the point of people talking about how these folks are going to be able to live with one another after this war is over. What kind of basis might there be for reconciliation between these people? And perhaps it was unrealistic to talk about that, at least at this point. Well, the end of my little story is in a sense unhappy. At least I'm unhappy with it. And that is, I think they produced a very good statement, and Jeff Sachs and other people have made good use of the statement since. They've publicized it. They brought it to the attention of European leaders and others who might find it persuasive or might find it influential. But in the end, it was just a statement. I mean, there was no real media strategy. And one reason there was not much real media strategy was, this is just my own view. I don't even want to be, I guess this is being recorded, but don't quote me on this, is I think Pope Francis really wants peace in the Ukraine. And he made a wonderful statement about kind of the absurdity of dramatizing this conflict as a conflict between democracy and autocracy, good democracy and bad autocracy. But the Catholic Church has got relations with the governments of Poland and Lithuania and Latvia and, and Ukraine for that matter. And at a certain point, I kind of sensed that the church itself, which was not a formal sponsor of this talk, but which was housing the talk, which was giving us this beautiful chapel of Pope Pius IV to meet in, that the church was, in a sense, backing off, or what they wanted this to happen with this statement was that It should be privately communicated to people who it might influence, but it shouldn't become a kind of political football. It shouldn't become an inflammatory statement. Well, I know Jeff Sachs, for his part, is being plenty inflammatory with it, and other people at the meeting feel, are not afraid to be inflammatory with it. So we're kind of all hoping that the Pope does what he really wants to do, and goes to Moscow and goes to Kiev, and tries to make some peace. What the whole experience leaves me with, however, again, and I come back to my kind of the gloomy beginning of this talk, is a sense of how isolated we were there and how isolated many of us still are here in trying to talk sense about this conflict. And since I'm supposed to be in the education business, although I'm getting ready to retire in a year or so from active teaching, it bothers the hell out of me that we haven't found a way to educate our own people to recognize these patterns in which they're being exploited for the benefit of the most narrow kind of military, industrial, et cetera, interests. Who benefits from this war? Who benefits from this war other than a few companies and a few politicians? And yet, even people who, we know that many of our people they're not inherently pro-war, they're not in love with the violence, but somehow they haven't figured out yet, or we haven't found a way to help them figure out how to immunize themselves against this kind of propaganda. To open the New York Times every morning as I do, and to see the most vicious sort of propaganda. They can't talk about Putin being happy about something. They talk about him gloating. They can't talk about the Chinese leadership doing anything constructive about anything. And our not just uneducated people, but the sophisticates, who subscribe to the New York Times, eat this up. And that clearly many of the progressives in Congress, if they're not eating it up, at least they're afraid to stand up against it. So what do we do about that? I wish I could tell you. You're going to have to tell me. But I certainly appreciate the work Mass Peace is doing, and I'm very happy you asked me to be a guest. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rubenstein. That was a terrific presentation and very sobering one. Marcy, why don't you take this minute to go ahead and call on our attendees to take action? I will put a link in the chat that they can use to do that.
Sure, thank
you.
you.
You have a second link as well that we can use together.
Terrific. Thank you, Professor Rubenstein, for your talk. I'm sure we'll have a lively Q&A period following this action. So, what we want to do at Massachusetts Peace Action and Code Pink is not just talk, but to take action, right? We're all together. This is an opportunity. So, Cole, if you can post that a few times in the chat, this is a message that you can sign on to. It's pretty easy. You just click. And I'm going to read it out so you see what you're signing. It says, negotiate an end to the Black Sea blockade in Ukraine, stop global starvation. We know that the stakes are incredibly high, right? It's not just pushing us to the brink of nuclear catastrophe, which is the highest stake of all. It's not just environmental destruction or loss of life, but also famine throughout the Middle East and Africa, since Ukraine and Russia provide 40% of the world's grains. So this says the head of the United Nations Food Program predicts hell on earth from the hunger crisis triggered by the Ukraine war, unless we can end this blockade and end this war. The way to do that is through negotiations and diplomacy, not escalation, that will turn the Black Sea into an even more dangerous war zone. The United States and NATO's escalation of the war with sophisticated weaponry, intelligence, and blanket sanctions is leading us down a dangerous path of protracted war, if not nuclear catastrophe. The Biden administration's support for negotiated settlement is crucial to ending the crisis to feed the starving in Yemen and across the Middle East and North Africa. Tell the president to support a negotiated settlement now. So this is in the form of a petition to be delivered to the White House. So please do sign on. And I also have a Code Pink action that I will post in the chat. And this is just a one-click, very similar message saying there's no military solution, right? Right now, we see the Ukrainians are not doing so well in the East. I don't know who thinks that they can beat Russia militarily. It would mean, as we've talked about, a very long war, right? Lots of people would lose their lives. If not, regional use of short-range nuclear weapons leading to long range. So please, there we go. One-click politics, just fill it out and tell your House reps to speak up. Tell Biden to pick up the phone, give Putin a call. Let's resolve this. It's crazy, right? So thank you so much. And I think, Cole, perhaps we can give a report at the end of how many people have signed on.
Yes, Marcy, we have 154 people on the Zoom tonight. So we would like at least 100 of them to take this action. We're not going to let you hang up until at least 100 people have followed through and contacted the decision makers. This is how we make change. We have to show there are people out here who have opinions and who are pressing for change. So that's what it's about.
And do pick up the phone, tonight or tomorrow, leave a message for your House representative. I've heard from various staffers in these House representatives' offices that it only takes like anywhere from 10 to 30 people to call about an issue for somebody to pay attention, So that's the least we can do, right? So here's the number for the Capitol Hill switchboard. Let's all make a call sometime tonight. Leave a comment. All right. Thank you so much for taking that action. Back to you, Cole.
Great. And so I wrote out 6 questions that I was planning to ask Professor Rubenstein tonight, but he's already answered all of them. So I'm, instead of reading my questions, I'm going to start calling on people who raised their hands or who put a question in the chat. And first up will be Donald Smith. Donald, could you unmute?
Okay, hi. Professor Rubenstein, my idea was that more academics should speak out and should join together and to expose U.S. militarism, and particularly about Ukraine. I know that there are plenty of academics who would agree with us, and I hope that Chris Hedges isn't correct when he says that all of the institutions of society have been corrupted by money. So do you think there's any chance that academics could get together, sign an open letter, make some statement, get it published and get it exposed and get a lot of publicity about it, describing how we provoked this war and how we've been lied to? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. And I view it as a personal challenge to try to do that. I mean, to get to the other academics and see what I can do. I have to say that the response has not been super encouraging from other academics that I've spoken to so far. I mean, the power of pro-war propaganda is very strong, and the universities are not immune to it. But I'm very impressed with a few people. I mean, one of my colleagues is a woman who I think finds herself in the very difficult position to go public with some of this, but who is I know is very critical of what's happening. This idea of fighting this war to the last Ukrainian. So anyway, thank you for the suggestion. I'll personally get on it and see what happens.
That sounds wonderful. And just to couple that with the mood in Congress, as Marcy said earlier, Pramila Jayapal, who's head of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, is expected to circulate a letter calling on Biden to push for a negotiation strategy. Unfortunately, the letter also calls for continued arms shipments. So it looks like Code Pink and Mass Peace Action will not be signing the letter, but at least it is a step forward compared to the progressive Democrats, all of whom voted to send 40 billion to Ukraine about a month ago. So we may have to go incrementally on this, given the propaganda barrage that Professor Rubenstein has described, and maybe it'll be the same in academia.
Yeah, I mean,
I have a question,
go ahead.
if I may,
Sure.
and that is, Professor Rubenstein, you talked about the Pope and the feeling of urgency that he has for negotiations to resolve the crisis in Ukraine. Any chance that you're aware of that the Pope would join with a prominent rabbi and imam, to make it like an interreligious?
That's that's a terrific idea. And as a matter of fact, I've just written Karen Armstrong. You know her, the writer, a great writer on Christian history and on religion in general. She's one of the chair people of something that they call the intercivilizational dialogue, with some very famous people involved in it. So I wrote her already, seeing if she would be interested in doing something like this too, and getting other people in that group to do it. I think it's a great idea. Great idea.
Yeah, I'm sure it's not my idea solely, but yeah, I think it's really important because we know that religious communities hold tremendous political power.
Absolutely.
In the country and
They
elsewhere,
do.
right?
Absolutely.
Let's go to Jed Schwartz. Could you unmute?
Yeah, hi. You can hear me. Yeah, I guess you can hear
Yeah,
me.
we hear you.
So what I've been doing is reading this book called Putin's People by Catherine Belton, and heavily, very favorably reviewed. And the impression I get from reading that and some other books, I read some Masha Gessen also about that, about Putin and the Ukraine. And I read the Red Famine book by Anne Applebaum about the Ukrainian famine in the 30s. I think it's important that we somehow find a exit ramp for Putin to get off of this war. But I think that it's very difficult, because the only exit ramp, the only semi-rational, remotely rational grounds for his invasion is to stop Ukraine's association with what he termed the corporate neo-Nazi globalization degenerate movement. That's a real stretch, because in order to address that, you have to be able to explain, to understand a little bit what he's talking about. The initial reaction from the West was, how could Ukraine possibly be considered part of a neo-Nazi or Nazified movement since they have a Jewish president? That ignored the basic tenet of Nazism, which was that there are certain groups that they considered racial groups, which most anthropologists.
Hey, Jed, could I ask you to begin to wrap up?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. Anyway, yeah. Anyhow, the Nazi included the Slavs as a subordinate group that was destined for enslavement and starvation and eventual elimination, and that's all of the Soviet and Russian peoples, including the Serbs. So that there is, and Putin was dissatisfied with the.
Jed, let me cut you off there and ask Richard Rubenstein to respond. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think the question, a very good question, and I think it illustrates kind of the sort of task that we have to accomplish, which is just to go back to what I said before about shared responsibility for this conflict and moral complexity or moral ambiguity, that people will not find it very difficult to understand, especially since there's no kind of credible, relatively independent media other than our own online journals that we love, that's willing to explain that the Kiev regime was not in any sense Nazi, but it was supported by Nazis when it took power in 2014, that the Ukrainian army is not Nazi, but the Azov battalion is. When the Germans invaded Russia in World War II, there were Russians so discontented with their lot, they were Ukrainians so discontented with their lot and with Stalinism that they joined the Germans. That Stepan Bandera was maybe not directly a Nazi, but as much he was basically in the same boat as the Nazis. So that is a complicated past, which in the present has complicated forms, and so to understand that the label Nazi was no justification for the invasion is one thing, but then to say that Nazism has nothing to do with Ukrainian history or the current conduct even of the Ukrainian war in some parts of Ukraine was also false. So anyway, we'll figure out a good way to explain this. A lot of it, sometimes it reminds me, and I have to say that my own pessimism about it has its limits. When I think of what happened in Vietnam, in the Vietnam War, I was in Chicago for most of that, the hard time of the war, and I was a co-chair of the Chicago Peace Action Coalition, and it looked like that war was never going to end, and that nobody was ever going to learn anything from it. And it ended quicker than we thought it was going to end. I think maybe it's not, I want to kind of second guess myself a little bit here and say, when the Russians are finished controlling the Donbass, which is going to happen very soon if it hasn't already happened, then there will be clearly an opening for negotiations. There will be actually, at that point, no reason for Putin to not want to negotiate. Then the ball is going to be in the Western court. And the decision then for the Westerners will be, do they want to have another 5 or 10 years of war? Do they want to foment, foment war in Eastern Ukraine and Southern Ukraine? Or will there finally be an end to negotiations, and what the role will be of simple fatigue with war? The role that finally, in some ways, the factor that finally probably ended the war in Northern Ireland, the civil conflict in Northern Ireland. It was had much to people who are very familiar with that have told me it was fatigue with the war as much as anything else that ended that conflict. I think maybe it's not too much to hope for a fairly early end to this war, and to try to work for that end in the way that Code Pink is suggesting. Anyway.
Thank you. Next up, I'm going to call on Paul Shannon. Paul, please unmute.
Thank you, Cole. Thank you, Professor Rubenstein. Thank you for such a thoughtful presentation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I wanted to look a little bit at this term you use called Satanization, and just see how often that has come up in our lifetime as a way of justifying one war or another. What's being done with Putin is the same was done with Saddam Hussein and other devils before then. And it just seems to me that it would be well worth our while to try to figure out how to deconstruct this emotional plague that is always waiting there, no matter how catastrophic the Iraq war turned out to be. Here it is in a new form. And if this war ever should end, it will be there again for whenever whoever it is that decides these things decides to mobilize it. How do we start to get at this? Because until we do, we're not going to be able to have rational conversations about the histories of wars, what people are really all about, and all that.
I don't know. I wish I knew. But somehow it seems to me that the kind of, sometimes I think and this, I'm just kind of guessing at this, but it seems to me that the kind of discourse that we engage in isn't dealing with people at the kind of level of the ideological / emotional level that needs to be dealt with to kind of to expose the exactly this kind of thing that you're talking about and help people to deal with it. I mean, I don't want to be talking about therapy, I'm not talking about psychotherapy, although sometimes it does remind me of Wilhelm Reich, as Nazism got stronger in Germany, talking about the need for street corner psychoanalysis. I think we need to think and talk more. I'll just leave it here. We need to think more about how we communicate with other Americans and people outside America as well, and to ask ourselves: are we dealing with them on a level that makes a difference to them, that they understand? I mean, part of what we need to do is exactly what Code Pink is talking about, and do and operate the political machine as much as we can operate it. But part of it has to do with how we relate to other people in this country who are, I would say, are hurting, and then are misconceiving the sources of the hurt and the solutions to the hurt. And I don't think we're very good at doing that yet. We're still using a kind of political discourse, which either assumes rationality or a kind of interest-based, sort of thinking. When what this has to do with, really, this has a lot to do with emotional damage and people's values. So I don't.
I agree. Too often we just want to talk to people who share our opinion. Medea joined us, and Cole, if it's okay with you, I'd love to hear from
Yes,
Medea
please.
on her thoughts on all of this. Medea's been working on a book on NATO, so she's well versed. NATO, Medea, can you hear us?
Well, I was going to say Medea didn't get to hear Professor Rubenstein's talk, but she was planning to update us a bit on Afghanistan and Ecuador tonight in any case. So maybe at least Medea, you could update on those.
I think she's looking for her unmute button.
Have to maybe unmute her.
Maybe later.
I'll do it. Wait a minute. I can get it. Okay.
But yeah, I mean, as you're working on that, I just want to say to the professor that I think it's an excellent point that we've got to break out of these bubbles we're in. And, just the other day, I tried to do that and have a conversation, not with somebody who was hostile, not a troll, but somebody who sincerely is open-minded, but definitely feels that we should be sending weapons there to arm the Ukrainians. They don't think they've gotten enough weapons in the last several years. They don't see that it's futile to press for military solution. So, what's the opening? What's the opening line that's going to, what are the lines of argument that might promise success? One of my friends says, well, we need to ask them, do they see a military solution? Do they see Ukraine beating Russia? And if so, at what price? What's an alternative? Kind of thing.
Okay, Medea, I think you're unmuted now.
Yes, I'm so sorry I missed the conversation. I assumed it was 8 o'clock, our usual time, but I thank you professor and have already heard that it's been a very rich conversation. And I can't really comment on it because I came in so late, but I do know that in my own circles, I feel there is a switch going on, and that people, maybe for unfortunate reasons, are less interested in Ukraine at this point, more interested in their own pocketbooks and what they see at the pump and in the grocery store. And that, is an opening for us. So I was going to give a little update, speaking at the pump in the grocery store, about what happened in Ecuador, because it is related. There was an uprising for 2 weeks of indigenous people saying that the price of gasoline was too damn high and the price of goods in the grocery store was too damn high. And what was the government going to do about it? And unlike us here, where we have a protest maybe on a Saturday or a Sunday when nobody's at work, and we walk around in a circle and go home, they camped out for almost 2 weeks and shut down the country, causing billions of dollars worth of damages to the business community, particularly. And they got results in that the government, it might not be what we like because we want to see an end to the use of fossil fuels. But in the meantime, for poor people, they got a subsidy put back on. They got a monthly package that would go to the poorest people in the country. They got the resignation of the finance minister, the minister of the economy, minister of health, minister of transportation. And they got a jubilee on repayment of loans, small loans to rural people, particularly the farmers. So it's just to give a sense that, if we're really serious about changing government policies, we can look to other countries where they are really serious about using people power in a way that gets results. I also had wanted to give just a very brief update on Afghanistan, if that's okay. And
Yeah.
that was that, there is 20 years of war, and people should really be asking, what did the US do, spending trillions of dollars on this war, and now the Taliban is back in control. On the very negative side, there was a Loya Jirga, a gathering of the religious people and the tribal leaders. Over 3,000 people came. There was a lot of pressure on them to invite women, and they said, well, women will be represented because their sons and their husbands will be there. So they didn't invite any women. And we thought, well, at least in the end, they will use that as a time to bring up this issue about women's education and finally, open up the secondary schools. And it seems that didn't even come up. So it was extremely disappointing. On the positive side, the US envoy for Afghanistan, Tom West, was just in Doha at meetings to talk about how that $3.5 billion can be used to help the collapsing Afghan economy, especially in the wake of the disastrous earthquake they had that killed over 1,000 people. And so hopefully we'll hear something in the not too distant future about a way for the Afghan Central Bank to start getting some of its money back. So those are the updates I wanted to give. Thank you.
Thank you, Medea. That's great. Let me just remind people once again to take the action and contact President Biden, Secretary Blinken, and members of Congress. And I've put the link in the chat. And Marcy, if you would put the second link in the chat also. Professor Rubenstein, if you have 5 or 10 more minutes, we got 4 more people with questions. What I suggest we do, we're 5 minutes over, but a lot of, very few people have left the meeting. There's a lot of interest. I suggest we call in all those 4 people to get their questions out, and then you take them all together and see what you can make of them.
Okay,
If you're willing.
sure.
Okay, so now we have to go through this. Oh gosh. So telephone person 847-744, please unmute. Next up, Robert Demare. Next up, Michael Hoey, and finally, Mike Caggiano. If you could all unmute and throw out your questions. I don't think the phone person is unmuted yet. Robert, why don't you go ahead?
I basically wanted to suggest to Dr. Rubenstein that he consider consulting with Archbishop Sean O'Malley in Boston. He's one of 6 persons that Pope Francis contacts. I wrote this to you personally already, Dr. Rubenstein, but it seems to me he could be of great help. We don't want to leave the Russians the way we left the Germans after World War I. They are Europeans also, and they are human. So I invite you to contact O'Malley.
Thank you, Robert. Let's go to Michael Hoey.
My question deals with the great power competition that's been going on since 1800s between the Russian-speaking people and the English-speaking people, and how the military sales and the financing, the different World Bank versus whatever Russia's got to do that, and the oil, natural gas, and all that, how it's playing into a bigger picture. And maybe this war is just, what do you call, like a small display of the great power competition. I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Robert. Mike Caggiano.
Yeah, my thought was with the Satanization of the opposition, which is a really nice point. Why not give these people an opportunity to state their case directly to us? That, how about a page in the New York Times, have Putin tell us what's on your mind. What's your main problem? Like, it seems like they go way out of their way to mute any genuine communication from the actual enemy, so-called enemy. After the fact, we heard Vietnamese, the Ho Chi Minh said, yeah, we would have been happy to do X, Y, and Z with you guys. We were actually there some years earlier trying to work something out to help us develop. And this is all like 10, 15 years after the fact. I think some real-time opportunity for these people to actually get their point of view out to us without going through all the flag catchers and the mists of war and what have you. I think that it can't do anything but help. That's what I have to say.
Thank you. And then the last person is Jake Aronov on the phone. Jake, I don't know if, oh, you are unmuted. Go ahead, Jake.
Okay, thanks, Jake Aronov from Chicago. Yeah, I have no sympathy at all for Putin. You're not taking into consideration the Budapest Accord of 1994, which was signed by Boris Yeltsin and whoever was president of Ukraine at the time, and probably co-signed by Bill Clinton and half dozen other parties, saying that Ukraine would give up their nuclear weapons arsenal. At the time, Ukraine controlled about 40% of the nuclear weapons in the world. They had to give them up to Russia on condition that Russia never invade Ukraine. And so in 2014, when Putin invaded Crimea, he went back on this treaty. And so that has to be taken into strong consideration there.
Okay, thank you, Jake. Professor Rubenstein, good luck with all that.
Okay, well, let me, these are such good questions. I could stay here for hours and talk to you all, but let me say first about, I'm glad you're writing me about the Archbishop in Boston. And I'll certainly take advantage of that contact. I've had very good luck in being a peacenik in the U.S. My education as a peacemaker really started because of a guy named Daniel Berrigan. And ever since then, I've had a kind of a warm spot in my heart for Roman Catholics who are interested in peace. Berrigan really educated me. So I'll be very happy to talk to the Archbishop if I get a chance. The second comment, I think, was, if I'm remembering it, was about sanctions. At least I've written the note that I've written to myself about it was about sanctions, about the kind of the impact of this, the impact of the war, the great power relations. I'm sorry if I'm skipping somebody here, but But I think it's quite right to look at this as a complicated great power conflict. Absolutely right. And just to note that it seems to be that the Westerners in this conflict, that the Americans in particular, thought that they could have a war without bullets at first, or at least a war without committing U.S. troops to any kind of action in the field by using sanctions, which were being described as a kind of nonviolent. Some people describe them as a nonviolent alternative to war, and sanctions which had in some ways a kind of glow about them, especially deriving from their use in the campaign against apartheid in South Africa. And then what we're finding out about sanctions is people, by the way, forget that the last nonviolent act that happened between the American empire and the Japanese empire in the 1940s, in the late 30s, early 40s, was the imposition of sanctions by the Roosevelt administration on Japan, which resulted in the attack on Pearl Harbor. We sanctioned oil and scrap metal, and that apparently decided the Japanese to make an attack on America rather than what, anyway. The whole idea that sanctions are a nonviolent alternative to war turns out to be way too simple. Sanctions, especially if they cause suffering in another country, can be considered an act of war, and then they don't work out the way they're expected to work out. I mean, in the current war, the sanctions are hurting Europe more than they are hurting Russia, as far as we can tell. For various reasons, the Russians are doing okay. The Russian economy is doing okay. And Sachs, by the way, mentions this in his latest article, while it's really starting to hurt Europe. In particular, the gas cutoff is starting to hurt Europe. When Russia, of course, cuts the gas off, it's called economic warfare. But when the U.S. or the West does sanctions against Russia, it's considered nonviolent defense of whatever. So the problem then for us is not simply to eliminate military confrontations. The problem for us is to eliminate destructive conflict. The problem for us is to stop, to try to figure out how to heal relationships, which, if they're not healed, produce various forms of coercion, some of which are labeled nonviolent, but which tend always in the direction of violence. So anyways, the sanctions are not working. The great power conflict is continuing, and how to engage in great power conflict, right? How to engage in great power, how to redefine great power relations so that we somehow emerge from this imperial era, the imperial centuries, maybe millennia, that we've been living through, and discover a new way of being in the world with other people is still an unanswered question. I remember Johan Galtung, the Norwegian peacemaker, telling me the other day, we were talking the other day, and he said, you Americans are going to be so relieved when you don't have to bear the burdens of empire anymore. You're going to be so happy not to be responsible for the world. You know, cultivate your own garden. And we're not there yet. We're not close to being there yet. And it certainly complicates things to deal with it, kind of an empire in decline. And empires don't linearly decline either. You know, they go down, they come up, they go down, they come, they revive themselves. Look at what Rome did. But to deal with an empire which ultimately is in decline among a people who don't recognize that it's an empire at all, is again, it's kind of the part of our educational mission. All right. Finally, the last comment had to do really with Putin and his isolation. And I have to say that I've been in the anti-war movement a long time, and I remember that in the days of the Vietnam War, there were people who admired Ho Chi Minh, the George Washington of his country, and all of that. I actually wasn't among them, but I understand. I understand why people would admire him, and especially why Vietnamese would admire him. But in the current anti-war movement, I don't know anyone who admires Vladimir Putin. Now, he's not an ally. He's not a friend of liberty, and he's not a friend of decency, and he's not a friend of sexual equality. He's not a friend of really of socialism. But it doesn't matter in a sense, right? It doesn't matter. We're not here to judge the leadership of the world and decide how much force we're going to apply to this leader or that on the basis of his virtue or his vice, or how much we agree with him politically, right? We're here to try to create conditions in which the Ukrainian war won't take place again, and to create conditions in which leaders like Vladimir Putin won't become leaders. I mean, I think that's what being in favor of human emancipation means. But right, it's not necessary for us to approve of Vladimir Putin, to treat him, as the first speaker said in among the questioners, to treat him and his people as human beings. So I'm sorry if I think I probably left out some of the people who asked these good questions, but I apologize. But I do want to thank you again for the chance to be here and to talk to you, and I hope we'll be able to continue the conversation at some point.
Thank you, Professor Rubenstein. You give us hope, you give us courage to keep on pushing, and we appreciate that so much.
Okay,
Marcy, would you like to say a final word before we close?
Well, I just wanted to again invite any of you who are interested in joining our Peace in Ukraine Coalition to email me. I'll put it in the chat, marcy@codepink.org. We will have a Zoom tomorrow to discuss our next steps. We had a Global Day of Action. We were in solidarity with the No to NATO movement and applying whatever pressure we could to our representatives to push for negotiations as well. So do join us tomorrow. I put my email in the chat. Thank you. And also, I'll again post the code pink, one click, send a message to your representative in the House to urge Biden to pursue negotiations. Pick up the phone. Thank you.
We are suspending Code Pink Congress for the summer. The next Code Pink Congress event will be on September 6th. However, we do have other blockbuster programs for you, which I put them in the chat. We have 3 peace activists reporting back on the NATO protests in Madrid last week: Joseph Gerson, Paki Whelan, and Ann Wright. That's on Thursday night. And then we have observations from Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria, a report back by Jeff Klein, who just got back from a two-month trip in the Middle East, and that is on Monday night. So have a good summer, and we hope to see you back in the fall, and keep working for peace. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.